welcome to our show tonight. My name is Jim McGuire, your host. And tonight we have a very important show about protecting our youth today in Putnam County, Westchester County, and all the counties, actually. It's a drug crisis in our backyard. We have a wonderful panel tonight that's going to talk about this, but I just want to say a few things, the use of heroin diminishes one's life, especially if you're a young person. You lose your desire to go to college, you lose your desire to have friends, you lose your desire to get a good job. And most of all, there's no peace in the home when you use heroin. So it's a dead-end street to go, and I just think that this show is going to be all about that, how to avoid the use of drugs and things like that. And so I just want to mention who's here tonight. We have with us tonight Susan and Steve Solomon, who started the drug crisis in our backyard. They're here tonight to talk to us. And also Lillian Newman from St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Harrison. Is it Harrison?
St. Vincent's.
St. Vincent's Hospital. I'm sorry, St. Vincent's. I always get that wrong, St. Vincent's. Is it Harry?
It's Harrison.
Harrison. It's Harrison. Okay. And she's the outreach coordinator there for substance abuse in the whole hospital, I believe, right?
Programs,
Very good. Susan, could you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in this drug crisis in our backyard?
Yes. Actually, my husband and I started Drug Crisis in Our Backyard back in May 2012 after the loss of our son Justin to a heroin overdose. We started it with Lou and Carol Christensen, who also lost their son June 9th, 2012. And all of us felt that there was not enough information out there about addiction. At least if it was out there, it wasn't in the public eye. So we came out publicly, told our story, that we were living with addiction for 10 years. My son started early on and spiraled downhill to heroin. So that's how we started, and that was about 2.5 years ago, almost 3 years ago now, Jim.
Thank you, Susan. Steve, could you tell us a little bit about your involvement in the program?
Well, as Susan said, Jim, we started the program. A lot of the initial focus for us was awareness, because we were dealing with a problem and we were hiding the problem because we was a little bit of shame, and the stigma of addiction was something that was embarrassing at the time. And we felt that after Susan wrote a letter to a local newspaper and came out about what we were dealing with, we got a very warm response from the community. And so people were getting in touch with us and saying they were dealing with the same problem. So we founded the group to help give people a vehicle to come forward and to also seek help and to kind of get away from the stigma and the negative feeling about addiction, because addiction, we know, is a brain disease. It's not a bad choice, it's not poor character, but it's a brain disease, and it's something that's treatable. But the first step in treating of anything is admitting that you have something and coming forward. And so that's what our group was trying to strive and get the word out in the community. And I have to say that I think on a local level in Putnam, and now moving into some of the other counties, we see a lot more talk about it, a lot more publications coming out about it, and I think we've raised the level of awareness, and which is a good first step for us.
Well, thank you, Stephen. Lillian, tell us about St. Elizabeth's.
St.
Vincent's, excuse me, St.
St.
Vincent's.
Vincent's.
Sorry, I used to go down to that hospital in Lower Manhattan.
Okay.
So, tell us about your hospital and what
St.
programs you have.
Vincent's is the largest behavioral health system in the 3 counties in the county. And we have different programs for substance abuse and mental health for young kids ages 5 all the way up to older people in their 80s and 90s. I mean, there are different inpatient and outpatient programs that address every possible issue with substance abuse and mental health.
Is that a new hospital? Has it been around for a
No,
while?
it's been there since the 1800s.
Wow, long time.
Yeah, because it was founded by the Sisters of Charity, and St. Vincent's has been in Harrison a very long time.
Was that related to the one in Manhattan?
Yes, it was. Mhm.
Is that closed, the one
That's
down there?
closed.
I
That
remember
closed
that one,
about
yeah.
in 2010, I
Wow,
think.
okay. Steve, could you tell us about the forum and what goes on?
Well, we have regular forums in the drug crisis, and we have another one coming up in March 5th at Mahopac High School. And the specific topic of that is protecting our youth. We're going to talk in the forum. We'll have speakers, select speakers, talking about how to identify drug use with young people, how to approach young people about it, signs and symptoms, and just generally how to talk about and work towards prevention, because prevention of initial drug use among young people is a very important way to stop and nip the problem in the bud. We do a good job with law enforcement in the county, but it's almost at the point where you want to try to get people to stop using in the first place. So the forum is going to be about ways and strategies around protecting our youth from starting with drugs and alcohol. You know, in the county, from the surveys that we've taken with the students, the age of first use of alcohol and marijuana is still very young. It's improved slightly, but we're talking between 12 and 13 years old. Wow. So it is early on that you want to start these conversations, and again, the forum is going to be about those kinds of topics.
So does the forum, do parents find the forum helpful, Susan?
Yes.
Parents, do they?
Yeah.
How do they?
Our feedback is from the parents that show up. Our feedback is that they get information. They walk away with information. Actually, at this forum, we are going to have District Attorney Adam Levy and Drug Crisis in Our Backyard, and Doreen Lockwood from Putnam Community Services. And also we're going to have a person that is in recovery tell his story about what he started with and what steps happened in his life to bring him into a treatment center. He's from he's right now in St. Christopher's, and he's going to come and talk about his recovery. So really, we really want the focus of this forum to be about decreasing risk factors by offering protective factors for the child, even at a very young age, like young, toddlers.
What's an example of protective?
A protective factor is modeling behavior that you do not want your children to start doing. So at a very young age, children are like, they want to copy their parents. It's very important. Their parents are their models. And so modeling behavior that we want our children to be like, the way we want them to be, that is a protective factor. So not smoking in front of your children is a good idea. It's a protective factor. Okay? And in each age group, there are multiple protective factors that can be used to help reduce risk factors. And I know that Lillian could tell you a lot about risk factors because she is a professional in this area.
Well,
Sure. You want to tell us?
Sure. Well, I know that the prevention programs that I do, we start with helping kids make healthy decisions. So if you teach them how to make healthy decisions, that's a protective factor. If you also teach them about how to say no to kids that might want to ask them to get high, that's a protective factor. Having prevention in the schools and at homes and forums, those are protective factors when you raise awareness. Also keeping your kids involved in whatever religious, school, sports, those are protective factors. And just, having an atmosphere in the home, in the community, where people look out for each other, where if you're doing something, you think twice because the neighbor might tell your parents. That's a community that is a protective factor. And that reduces the risk.
Sure.
Because if you think your neighbors are going to tell your parents, you'll think twice.
Another thing,
Yes.
if I could add, Jim,
Sure.
a lot of parents need to be aware of whether or not addiction or alcoholism exists in the family tree somewhere.
That's a risk.
And because that's a big risk, and I think,
Sure.
if you have a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or some in the family tree that has experienced an issue with substance abuse, it's kind of like you need a heightened sense of awareness of what's going on with your kids. Because they have a predisposition at that point because of genetics and also because of modeling behavior that they potentially are higher at risk. And again, is something else that we want to make sure people think about and reflect about what's going on in their own families when they're talking about the risk factors for their own kids.
And you could,
Yeah.
jump in quickly.
We have a lot to say,
Depression.
Jim. So
Sorry.
Who's wants to go first?
Depression. Kids that suffer from depression, ADHD, those are risk factors that if not looked at and kids don't get help for, they can substitute substances and drugs because it'll make them feel better.
Right,
and it, takes away whatever pain they might be, and that's all gone.
So we want to make sure that we have the date is March 5th at the Mayapack High School,
very good.
7 p.m. everybody is welcome. We would like the community there. It's an important topic, and everybody that comes will get something out of it. So please come.
I think,
Another-
go ahead.
I wanted to say,
Go ahead.
another risk factor is age of use.
Oh.
Research has shown that a child that uses drugs at 15 years old is 7 times more likely to get addicted to drugs than someone that uses at 21 or after 21. And that's
I see.
because, Jim, the brain is more developed
Right.
at age 21 and higher. So even if we could keep our kids from experimenting with drugs until after they're 21, that would be a really big help because age is another risk factor.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the other protective things is the wrong friends.
That is a risk
You know,
factor.
that's they could protect them from the wrong people.
Right.
That's a big thing too.
So
you
if
know?
we could
Wow.
get if we could get parents to feel more comfortable putting those boundaries in, like we don't want you to be hanging out with this person or that person. Parents are uncomfortable with that. I know
Yeah,
that. I know I was
Probably.
uncomfortable with that.
Right, then the children become very, especially if they're with the wrong people and they know it, they're going to be very defensive about that. But I think the parents need to know who their kids are hanging out with, and because they're very strong influence on the decisions.
Should dialogue start when they're very young? Dialogue,
Yes.
like at the dinner table when they're only
Yes.
about maybe 7 or 8. You know,
Younger.
tell them about
Yep.
what's
Even
going
younger.
on.
Yep,
I think,
Yeah.
getting that open
Yeah.
communication and just the expectation that there is that communication, I think, is important. You know, you instill that as a pattern of behavior at a young age, then when they're teenagers, it's just there. It's more likely to be there.
Right.
And also, the consequences of using in the family. You know, you have to set the rules real early that this behavior isn't tolerated and talk about it, and kids know the consequences. Sorry, Susan.
Parents shouldn't smoke. I mean, this may sound a little restrictive, but parents shouldn't smoke cigarettes in front of their kids, especially young children, because the kids emulate parents' behavior. You know, you are heroes. Parents are role models to their kids. They think that whatever the parents do is okay. It's something to be respected and modeled. So even something as innocent as smoking cigarettes is a bad message that you're setting to your kids. And if you do drink in the home, I think you have to be very cognizant of the fact that your children are watching you do these things.
Very true. What's the current status of heroin use today now? Is there an epidemic? Anybody want to just take that one? The heroin, is it really bad
Oh,
today?
it is an epidemic. I mean, Governor Cuomo came out in an address in September saying that, you know, there's a heroin epidemic in New York. And actually, Putnam County, Dutchess County, Rockland, and Westchester are considered high traffic drug areas. They've been identified by the federal government as high traffic drug areas. Yeah, which is a very dubious honor. There is more money for prevention to the counties that have been designated. So, and there aren't a lot of counties in the entire country. There's only about 16 counties in the entire country that have been designated, and we've
So-
got 4 of them in our area. So
If you live in the Hudson Valley, you need to
bad.
be putting pressure on your legislators to do something about this epidemic, especially if you have kids, because now, as Susan mentioned, there is some additional funding that's available because of this designation, and we need to seize the day with that and make sure that there's pressure and that we're asking for these funds and getting in some programs, you know, instituted or at least initiated in the counties.
Do you see that down where you are too, the heroin
Yeah,
epidemic?
there's heroin down there. I think it's not as prevalent up here, or we're not hearing about it. I think that's what it is. We're not hearing about it. We're not seeing as many young adults dying. I think in the last 6 months since October, I think 4 or 5 that I know of in White Plains, Eastchester, 2 in Rye have died recently. Last
boy.
2 months or
we
so.
had,
3 months.
we had 2 this
Yeah.
past week.
Yeah.
Where, in this?
Yeah.
In Putnam.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
A guy
It's
or a girl?
February
Or a
8th.
boy or
2
girl?
boys.
2 boys, huh?
You're very young 20s. It's terrible.
Boy,
Yeah.
That's a terrible
It is terrible. And you know, this is predominantly now a middle and upper middle class epidemic. It's not an inner city, low income problem. It's heavily white, upper and middle class people that you initially would not think would have a problem with this. Yeah.
And I think if I can jump on that, I think that's the problem also, because no one ever thought of heroin as a white middle class drug. You thought of it as an urban,
Yeah.
down in the city, in the inner city, in shooting galleries in the 60s, and no one thought about that it's up here. And I think that's what took a lot of parents by surprise when the kids were using heroin, right?
And there's still a lot of denial out there,
Yeah.
I think. And again, people need to be open to the fact that even though they don't think there's a problem in their household, they need to be aware that there could be, and that maybe they might be rationalizing it away that it's not in my home. And I think people need to be aware that it very well could be. Some of the great friends that may seem to be upstanding kids that their kids are friends with could be dealing drugs. I mean, it's that prevalent around here right now.
Jim, I'd like to say something
Go ahead,
about
Sue, sure.
that because, we don't want to sound like, like crisis, whoa, this is a crisis, this is a crisis. It is a crisis, it's an epidemic. But kids are starting with pot and alcohol.
Yeah.
Right.
They're not starting with heroin. And we run a support group on Tuesday nights, every other Tuesday night in the Mahopac Library, okay? And this past Tuesday night, we had a speaker. She was fabulous. She was 25 years old. She is a recovering heroin addict.
Wow.
When she came in, she told us her story. She started with pot and alcohol, and that's how they start. And then
Yeah.
if they have the other risk factors, if they have a propensity towards it, family, the family has it, if there's a genetic predisposition, they like the way it feels. So then they try the next stronger drug, and then they say they're never going to try the next drug, which might be pills, but then they try it. And then
Yeah.
they say they're never going to start heroin, but then they try it because now that's a lot cheaper.
Sure.
And that's the progression. It's not like, oh, I'm going to go out and take heroin tonight.
That's right. It happens in increments. That's a good point. And it starts even with cigarettes. When they start to make decisions that are, to do something that's, either illegal or not healthful, that's when the wrong path is being gone down.
I remember as a kid in the Bronx, they used to use the word, the brothers of the school I went to used to say, my mother too, heroin is a scourge. That word used to scare me. That's like Attila the Hun, doing people in way over there in, China area. But I looked up the word scourge, what it means. The definition, it's evil, harmful, and destructive to the
That's it.
human being.
Well, there
They
you
used
go.
to tell us that.
That's it.
Heroin was a scourge. They were
It
saying
still
the right
is.
thing.
No, it still is.
1959, they were
But
telling
it's-
us.
But as you said, it's the cigarettes, it's the alcohol, it's
Yeah.
pot. And when we talk about a brain disease, when kids smoke cigarettes, it hits the reward system.
Yeah.
They like it, it feels good, it releases the dopamine, which makes them feel good. And then they just keep using, let's say, the cigarettes or the marijuana or alcohol because it releases dopamine. But people don't understand that after a while, your brain will reduce or stop producing dopamine. And so you'll go to the next thing and the next thing to keep producing it because the things that used to give you pleasure, they produces dopamine, doesn't work anymore.
Right.
And that's how people continue to use in
Sure.
the cycle.
Sure. Can parents somehow help them make better decisions when it comes to drug use? How can parents?
I think that it has to start out early in life,
Yeah.
and as Steve said, you're not going to sit down with a 13-year-old and start having a conversation if you haven't had the conversations from when they're very young.
Okay.
So another protective factor, Jim, is family meetings, and that's to bring the family together once a week and at a young age, very young age. Very young age, 1, 2, 3, 3-year-olds, have them sit around and just talk about their week or what they like, and so that when the time comes when you really have to start listening and they really have to, you have to hear what's happening in their lives, they're used to that pattern.
Right. Very true. That's a good point.
So
Yeah.
I think that's one. There's plenty of them, and we're going to talk more about that at the forum, more protective factors.
Right.
What is the biggest obstacle when it comes to treatment for young people? What is it who's creating the obstacle? Is it the kid? Who's
It's
doing that?
everyone. It's
Yeah.
because
Just what-
the disease of addiction wants you to continue to use. So think of it like this thing that is telling you everything that everyone else is telling you that it's wrong. It's not. It feels good. And you don't want to give it up because it becomes your best friend. So you don't want to go into treatment because that'll stop you from using. So let's say you get into treatment. If you have insurance, you get into treatment. And insurance doesn't cover as much time as people need. They need about 90 days, 3 months in treatment, outpatient treatment. So that's a deterrent. But getting them in there, and then when a person gets out of outpatient treatment, they need to have aftercare.
Aftercare, yeah.
So they finish the treatment program, but you still got to follow them and find out what's going on. And treatment just isn't about stopping the drugs. That's the first part. But what about making sure that people have jobs or can get back to school? Because it's not just the drugs, it affects their entire life. And as a treatment provider, we addressing all those issues in treatment and when they finish. I mean, you got to track people and say, okay, are you in school, jobs, what's the next step? Because we talk about getting clean and then relapsing. Because if people don't have sober supports and if they're not working or not going to school or, repairing the damage in the family, then stuff kicks up, and what's the first thing you do? You go back to using because that's what you know.
Right,
So we have
right.
to have them create different patterns of
It's a
behavior.
long process.
It
I
is.
think you're right, and I think
It's
one of the
not just-
steps that is probably least recognized is the aftercare. I think there are a lot of people that go through inpatient programs, but then when they get out, there's not the support mechanism out in the field. Because, when you go back to the community and back to familiar things, those are all triggers for people. Going back to work and things like that are dangerous for people that have been through programs because they're back to a regular pattern and they're back to people that they recognize that cause them to think about drugs. And, unfortunately, especially with opiates, once you open that door and use them, it's a lifelong struggle. So when you see a trigger and you've previously used opiates, you're going to want to use them again. And what's going to keep you from that is a support system,
That's
a very strong support system. And I think that's, and the insurance companies have not been good about providing that longevity of care. So I think we need to, and I think there's some more awareness now that we need to put pressure on these insurance companies to really think about or really provide services that are going to keep people off drugs for a long period of time. Not approving them for 3 days
Right.
and 5 days at a time,
I see.
but getting people into 3 and 6 month programs and
Yeah.
paying for it. Because in the long run, our society
That's right.
will benefit, and that's what the insurance companies are supposed to be all about, is protecting the society.
Susan, why do you think they relapse? What do you think people
Oh,
relapse?
I think just for the reasons they said, that
Yeah.
there's not enough support when they come out. They come back to places that are very familiar to them, people, places, and things, Jim.
Yeah.
They see somebody that they used with, and their brain, clicks off. I want to use again. They get that feeling, that urge to use, the craving.
Yeah.
So many people leave the area, and we were told to get Justin out of the area.
Oh,
We
yeah.
said,
Oh.
we knew someone who had long-term recovery and from heroin. He was an older man, and he said, "You've got to get your son out of this area." And that's very difficult. That's scary. It's
It is.
scary.
It is very
because
scary,
we
yeah.
were afraid we were going to lose him in Florida. We were going to send him to Florida, but we were afraid that we would lose track of him down there.
And and then never get back to
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'd like to say something about what New York State is doing.
Yeah. Any laws? Any new laws?
Yeah, there are 23 new laws were passed, bills were signed into law by Governor Cuomo in June. And one of those laws is to develop a work group to study insurance and have it be more accessible to people. And that work group is currently in Albany right now happening. And there's about 40 to 60 people involved in the work group, and I'm on that group. And so we hear the concerns of not only the providers, but also of the insurance companies. They have concerns too. And things are going to change with insurance companies and providers
Good.
for families, for the better. Right now, they're piloting a program in Dutchess, actually CAPE in Dutchess is Coalition for Addiction Prevention and Education. They're in Dutchess. And they have piloting a program for wraparound services for people struggling with addiction for 9 months. So what we're talking about
Right.
here is the aftercare that they so desperately need. Lillian, could
Yes.
you add to that?
Well, you know what it is? It's that even in an outpatient program, after a while, the benefits you've completed and you go back to your life, you go back to your routine, but if you're not followed through for 9 months to a year, you fall through the cracks. And even though there's a lot of support, you can go to AA and NA, there's different meetings out there, someone needs to track you. You need to be accountable to someone. We all do. And especially with this disease of addiction, you're accountable to no one except your drugs. So this gives you the time you're in, let's say, outpatient program, and 9 months that someone's on the phone talking to you, what's going on. You can call them. That's what I'm hoping the wraparound services are, that watch this person, and not just the addiction, the family has to get help also. What are they doing? How are they staying sober? School, work,
It's almost like a
every
coach, right? A
area.
coach.
That's
That's
right.
right.
Just to
Exactly.
follow them. That's right.
Right,
That's
but
right.
not a financial coach.
Right. No. No.
Advisor.
Right.
An advisor.
Right.
A person
That's
can
right.
advise you.
That's right. And
Because
that's
people
something
ma-
new. Oh, sorry. go
People
on.
make the mistake of thinking it, cognitively you could rationalize with an addict and say, don't you see that you're destroying yourself? Or even when they get out of an inpatient program, you get out and say, oh, now your head's screwed on right. But the drug addiction and the motivation to use drugs is not a cognitive thing. It's you could know that this is going to kill you, and yet the addict will still do it. And I think that's where
that's the sad
the
thing.
long-term
That's right.
care is
That's-
important.
we've gotta
They
change
need the
that.
coaching, they need the aftercare, because on a cognitive level, they'll tell you they don't want to ever use
right.
drugs again, but then the next day they'll be looking for them.
And that's the relapse.
And that's the relapse.
That's the
exactly.
It took them a
relapse.
long time to get like that, so it could take a long time to
No,
get
that's
better.
right.
That's exactly
That's right. It's a
right.
year,
And,
at least.
and their brain is
Has
really
to
chemically changed,
right.
and so they're seeking it out because that's what their brain is telling them to do.
Sure.
And that's the process.
So there is hope, though, right?
Absolutely.
Yes,
There's
as long as
always
there's
We have to
life,
finish up
there's
soon, but
hope.
there
That's
is
right.
hope, you
Yes,
think, right?
and
Hope.
Yes.
also New York State has combatheroin.newyork.gov. That's a new website. It was launched in September, and it has providers there that people could go to for help and that kind of stuff. So
Very good.
that's a new website that was launched
Well,
by
listen,
Governor Cuomo.
thanks. We have to close now.
All right, Jim. We love working with you,
Yes,
Jim.
we
I really
do.
do
We
want
have
to
to
say that. You
close
do a
now.
nice job. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for coming. Really
No,
Thanks
thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you.
And thanks for watching, okay?
Thank you.